Year Disability Reshaped Progressive Politics. We're going to be tweeting today with hashtag disability@CAP, C-A-P, so follow along on Twitter if you are either in the room or following along in cyberspace. Before I say anything related to today's event, a quick public service announcement, a reminder that open enrollment is underway. So if you do not currently have your health insurance that you need, you can go to healthcare.gov and sign up for affordable, high-quality health insurance there. And remember, tell your friends, because there are lots of folks right now in the government who are trying to keep people from knowing about open enrollment. So with that out of the way, 2017 has brought a lot of things for progressives. Stress, sleep deprivation, heartache, increased wine consumption. On that one, I might be speaking about myself, but I think other people too. But one of the silver linings of this truly harrowing year has been well-deserved and long overdue recognition of the power of the disability community as leaders on the forefront of fights for progressive causes. If there's one image that has come to symbolize the healthcare fight, it's disabled protesters being dragged out of their wheelchairs in the halls of Congress. For many people, the healthcare fight was their introduction to ADAPT and other disability leaders. But the fight to save the Affordable Care Act and Medicaid was just the latest instance of disability leaders putting their bodies on the line, fighting for progressive causes. You might be wondering why I'm standing up here welcoming you today when my title has poverty all over it and disability nowhere in it. Well, my work on so-called disability issues began during my days as a legal aid lawyer in North Philadelphia, where I represented people with disabilities facing legal problems. It was doing that work that I had my eyes opened to the fact that people with disabilities, comprising 1 in 5 Americans, means that nearly every policy area and issue is a disability issue, from economic justice to healthcare to education to criminal justice to immigration to workers' rights and so much more. And that's why, after about 3 years of working to build out disability across all of the work that the Center for American Progress does, we are thrilled to have brought on Rebecca Coakley, who's sitting here in the front row, to launch a dedicated disability project here within the organization. And it comes as people with disabilities face grave threats on nearly every front in the current political climate, from proposals to upend Medicaid and the ACA, to attacks on the Americans with Disabilities Act itself, to Trump's Robin Hood and in reverse tax and budget plan that has a tax on disability in it, and so much more. As I said, 2017 has brought a lot of things for progressives, and one of those is a lesson I hope we can take to heart for much longer than just this year, that an attack on one of us is an attack on all of us, and that when we stand together as a united front, we can win. With that, I am thrilled to welcome an all-star lineup of speakers to the stage and to introduce my dear friend Rebecca Coakley, who joined CAP as a senior fellow earlier this year for disability policy. So with that, I'll welcome all of you to the stage.
Anywhere you want us specifically?
And wherever you want to sit.
Right in the middle?
Sure. You want to scooch out so Neil can get through?
Oh, no. Okay, cool. Easy for you.
Yeah.
It's my foot, but that's okay. It's fine.
Hi, I'm Rebecca Coakley. I am thrilled to be joining all of you today. This is my inaugural event here at the Center for American Progress.
Hey.
And I couldn't think of a better crew of people to have on the stage with me. I wanted to take a moment to thank the folks here at CAP, our logistics team, our CART folks, our ASL interpreters. CAP has really made a solid commitment, even beyond just words, to making this a hub and a home for the disability community. And I think it's important to recognize that we really do truly see disability rights as part of the broader civil rights fight that we have both this year, both historically this year and going forward. I am thrilled to have the following panelists here with me on the stage representing the Women's March and fresh in from the Glamour Women's Gala last night. We have Mia Ives Rubles. We have Neil Carter from New View Consulting. We have Catherine Perez from the National Coalition for Latinxes with Disabilities. And we have, last but not least, the amazing and dapper Bruce Darling from ADAPT. And so I want to ask you all to welcome them to join us today. And so, Bruce, I'm going to start with you because we've had this conversation a lot over the last year or so. As everybody continues to talk about the exciting momentum behind the healthcare fight, and particularly highlighting ADAPT, for a lot of folks, they don't realize that this is old hat to you guys. Y'all have been doing this for decades. And so I think it might be helpful if you took a moment or two to talk to our folks about ADAPT's history, the history of the fight that you guys have waged, and really even beyond the images that we saw, reprehensible as they were, of disabled folks being dragged out of wheelchairs. I know you got dropped on your head at one point. What was the messaging really behind that?
Okay, so ADAPT, I became a part of ADAPT in the mid-'80s when we were fighting to put lifts on public buses. So nowadays, that's just considered like, of course, there are lifts on public buses. No one even thinks about it. But back in the 80s, it was a very controversial issue. People fought us on that. And ADAPT did direct action around the country to fight to put lifts on buses to get access to public transit. And probably one of the biggest actions that people will remember is in the fight for the ADA, the crawl up the Capitol steps. And one of the things about that was it was just viscerally, it illustrated the problem through direct action. So the fact that we wanted access with the ADA, people with disabilities crawling up the steps, people could see what it was, and there were very visceral images. So in the healthcare fight, I know a lot of people think we just sort of appeared, but after we got the ADA, we worked really to secure the right of any disabled American to live in freedom. So that's what we have been doing for nearly 3 decades now. So that people may not think about it, but if you don't live with disability, you don't realize that as imperfect as the justice system is, or the so-called justice system is, an elderly woman who has memory issues has less due process protections before she's removed from her home and locked away than someone who's been accused of any crime, including murder. So we've been fighting to change the system so that the default is that Americans can live in freedom. And what was really interesting was how the healthcare fight dovetailed with the proposed cuts to Medicaid. And for people with disabilities, it was a visceral attack that we were fighting against. And it resulted, so as I was being dragged out of McConnell's office, hallway, whatever you want to call it, and found myself bleeding from my head, I didn't realize that moment would kick off the longest sustained, widest geographic spread of actions in the disability community that we had ever seen. So for, I don't even remember how long it was, across at least 30 different cities, people with disabilities took over offices and protested, basically against the cuts to Medicaid, the elimination of Obamacare, but really at the end for their own lives and liberty.
Well, I think you really hit on that for fighting for their own lives and their own liberty, for the right to live in the community. And I think the disability community has been historically, literally, the canary in the coal mine. We usually are sort of the first target, particularly as it relates to being in the public eye, living in the public, even just living our lives is considered inappropriate or offensive to some folks in this country. And I mean, we can go back to obviously the days of the big institutions. We can go back to the fact that Chicago had an ugly law in place until the 70s, which allowed you as a person with a disability to be arrested for solely being out in the public space. These to me are sort of the things that sort of planted the seeds for things that we continue to fight today, whether it be the Masterpiece Cake Shop case for the LGBT community, attempts to block our trans siblings from accessing public restrooms, attempts to block undocumented folks from being able to access emergency services. And this is for anybody, but how do you guys see today's threats against our sibling movements as they are just another step or an extension of what we've sort of been fighting for decades?
Yeah, absolutely. Can I jump in here?
Totally, Kat.
Okay. I'm Kat Perez. I'm with the National Coalition for Latinxes with Disabilities, and I'll make 3 points here. The first one is something that CNLD, that's the acronym for our coalition, stands for, is that, you can't really dice up people's identities, right? So when we're talking about these different groups, these are different advocacy groups, but, people embody several different identities at once, right? Like I'm Latina, I'm a woman, I'm disabled, etc. First point. Second point is that I think about this kind of in reading your question before is sort of like there's this fake normal in the center, right? And it like is increasingly getting smaller and smaller until it's just, right now with the tax, especially with the tax stuff, it's, you have to be this like CEO, white, rich, male, able-bodied, hetero, cis, all this stuff, right? And then you kind of like go farther and farther out of the circle, right? And I feel like at the very end are like queer people of color who are disabled, right? Like we're obviously not fitting the norm, right? We're not, and everyone else is sort of like approaching this norm, right? So what Rosemary Garland Thomas calls the normate, that's right in the center, and so I think that what other sibling movements, as you call them, can learn from us is like we're always the first to be called like not normal. We're left behind. We're left in the periphery. We're outside here in the margins of the margins. But as other sibling movements are gaining their rights or asking for their rights, for example, you brought up gay marriage with the what was the case called again?
The Masterpiece Cake.
Right.
Shop, yeah.
So as they are asking for their rights, right? Like we want them to remember that us in the margins, and not to sort of and not to buy into what is normal, right? So if that is, if what is buying them into rights or into privileges in our society is, looking like a typical heterosexual marriage, right? Like, am I making sense here?
Totally.
Yeah. Okay.
But also I think, also not selling us out with as further rights are achieved. I think one of the things that the millennials really get right, and I always think it's important to credit the millennials where credit is due, but is the idea that there is more than enough pie. There is not a fixed pie here in terms of civil rights. And empowering one community with rights does not take away another's community's civil rights. And making
Absolutely.
sure that we're mindful of that as we move forward.
My third point, was just that I really think that we can center disability in the progressive movement, and that we should be focusing the people on the margins of the margins, because if we make that acceptable, if we completely reject this norm and having to push toward the norm and to get our rights, especially because disabled people really just, we're not going to ever be normal, right? We're not in that center of that pie. We have different embodiment, we have different behaviors, we have different stuff that we're just never going to conform to this like white, cisgendered, hetero, able-bodied norm. So if we make it acceptable to be in spaces that accept people with disabilities on the margins of the margins, then I think, like you said, we're the canary in the coal mine. It will be more acceptable for all these other groups to be who they really want to be and construct the kind of society that we want to construct, rather than trying to get closer to the norm just to attain our rights.
Well, and Bruce, do you want to say
I was just going to say, I think it's important for us to watch the attacks against our rights. So I'm less looking at what we can learn from each other in terms of looking at how the attacks from folks who want to take our rights away play out differently with each community. So for me, I live in a world where part of my identity is attacked under religious freedom. So that I should be able to be excluded based on religious freedom. And then access issues are because we have unscrupulous lawyers who are undercutting small business by helping us enforce the ADA. And for me, I just look at the variety of approaches that are being used, and that we have to be diligent across all of those and recognize that each of them is an attack. And I think the thing that concerns me about the current attacks on the Americans with Disabilities Act is how progressives progressives have bought into some of the arguments of people who are trying to take away our rights. And I worry that they don't see how that's just, if they find a strategy where they can co-opt progressives to take away our rights, that will be something that will be used against all of us down the road.
Definitely, definitely. And building on what you guys have talked about a little bit, figuring out how we as a community how we can integrate disability rights and sort of disability rights philosophy, disability justice mentality into a broader agenda. You know, Mia, I think you totally kicked butt and took names this last year with your work with the Women's March community. And, you know, how do we make resistance accessible and inclusive? And why does it matter?
That's a huge chunk. So what I had done through my work was that I had seen a huge gap with the Women's March. I, like many people in the end of 2016, was severely disappointed, if that's the lightest that I can go
Devastated.
on. Yeah. About this election, but again, people within the margins have been attacked, even with Democratic leaders in power. But when I started seeing things about the march, the Women's March, I noticed a trend on Facebook of people saying, "Hey, what's going on about accessibility? Are you going to include us?" And I knew that I wanted to work on the Women's March. And for me, it was extremely important to make sure that the disability community was included in this, because I knew that we would have a long slog ahead of us. We had made so much progress with the Obama administration, with several of the laws, including employment laws, that were enacted that helped get us, get more people with disabilities hired. And so when I saw that issue, I began to ask questions. Like, I looked at every person's email that I knew that was organizing and was like, "Hey, what's going on with accessibility? Does anybody know about accessibility?" I knew a lot of other people that were asking, but they were sort of asking on Facebook. And so what I did was go one step further and just basically do a Google search and find people's email addresses. And I think it's definitely very hard to get organizations, especially new organizations, to realize the importance of accessibility. With the Women's March, and especially a lot of different progressive sort of action protests, they kind of happen on a spur of the moment. It's not like you get a whole year to establish what your accessibility plan is. And I mean, they don't even have time to figure out how they're going to stage things. And accessibility is just not in the picture. And so when I went up to talk to them, they're like, "Oh yeah, we'll look at accessibility." But then I was like, "Well, accessibility is not enough." Progressive movements, they tend to use disability, the disability community, but they don't tend to include us. And that's been a big issue, where you'll look at their unity principles or their mission statement, and it tends to not really include us. Or if it does, it's just sort of like this tiny little asterisk that says, "Oh, by the way, disability is included," and along with these other lists of people that were included. So what I had done was I spent a good amount of time trying to get as many people in the disability community to help work on some mission principles. And then when their unity principle actually came out, they didn't include disability very much. I think it was one little sentence again. And so what I did was I emailed them as soon as it came out and said, hey, ADAPT is going to come after you if you don't do something. And so they texted me really quickly and said, hey, can you look over this and redo this, and we'll release it. And so I spent the afternoon rewriting their unity principles to include disability in every single section of their unity principles, because disability is included in every single community. And I think that's something that people don't realize. And that's where the intersectionality and understanding that we aren't one person. I mean, we're not one identity, we are many identities. So I think, I think that's where the understanding that disability is included within all populations is an important starting point, and that will help us push progressive movements to understand that they need to be accessible and they need to be inclusive, especially within their unity principles, within their mission statements. It can't just be this sort of gift wrap of like outside, oh yes, we care about people with disabilities.
Well, and building on that, I think everybody, and we were talking about this earlier in the green room, everyone goes back, and I almost want to, if I wasn't pregnant, I would turn it into a drinking game, so I might turn it into like a chocolate eating game. But everyone, if I had $1 for every time a non-disabled person talked about 45's attacks on Serge Kovaleski, we were joking earlier that we want to turn the disabled reporter into its own hashtag.
Hashtag disabled reporter.
Yeah, hashtag the disabled reporter. Mind you, we are using the hashtag disability at CAP. And yes, it was egregious. And yes, it was obnoxious. But I also don't think anybody sitting here, like on this stage, has not been treated that way at some point in our lives, which I think is important to note. But what does it mean when we have, one side of the aisle or one community of folks that are sort of openly mocking us? And then on the flip side, we're continuing to deal with the struggle of having progressives on anti-disability rights legislation like HR 620, where they see our contributions to the healthcare fight, but then erase it. What's worse, being bullied, being victimized, being ignored? And how do we change that? And Neil, I'd love you to pipe in as our token strategist. But I really think it is, as we move forward off of all of this momentum of the last year, how do we turn this into a fundamental organizing, from an armchair strategy to an organizing strategy?
Sure. I think first, Neil Carter, senior partner of New View Consulting, also here representing the Harriet Tubman Collective. And I want to make sure, to your question, that I think it should be clear that in progressive spaces, something that I grapple with consistently is that our community, writ large, does a questionable, if not terrible, job of practicing without preaching. And there's a lot of, I'm sorry, it's in reverse. It's preaching and not practicing. But to take it a step further, there's almost a level of a disconnect between the organizers on the ground, the folks who aren't organizers, who just have lived experiences, who aren't active in ADAPT or any other advocacy organizations, and then you have the folks who are in progressive spaces who are occupying space, or to take it a step further, in the room because they have to be, not because they want to be, right? Because it's their job. There's probably a few people in this room, no disrespect, but there's probably a few people in this room who have to be here, not because they want to be here. And in progressive spaces, especially as it relates to the disabled community, I think we have to do a better job of recognizing that disability is just as much a part of the quote-unquote progressive movement as every other identity. We are the most ostracized, the most victimized, and oftentimes it's because a lot of the organizations that particularly candidates and elected officials, seek out when it comes to looking for support or input from the disabled community. They look to organizations that frame themselves as advocacy organizations, but actually cause more harm than good. Talking about organizations like Respectability, talking about organizations like Autism Speaks, and others. So there's certainly organizations that have, disability. They may hint at disability, or they may, kind of discuss disability, and they have political action committees. So naturally, candidates at every level will seek these organizations out and just assume that once they get that organization's support, oh, I have that disability check mark, I can move on now. Or they say, I've taken that picture with that physically disabled or cognitively disabled person, so I've checked that box off.
Or talk to their parents.
Or I've talked to their parents, exactly. I've taken that picture with them, had them in the room, didn't really acknowledge, had them on the campaign, but they were doing something, very nominally. They don't really make good mention of their participatory efforts, and they really kind of take advantage of it. There are a lot of government organizations as well that, again, government agencies that, are required to hire a certain number of disabled folks, and they use that as, well, same thing with every other marginalized group. We've hired 5, we're good. That's why I kind of laughed when you said token, because they do hire a lot of, to that point, they do, a lot of these government organizations and a lot of campaigns hire because they have to check off certain boxes. And even certain meetings that I've been to where leadership of these national organizations will come in a room, read from a cue card a statement about the inclusiveness of disability or wanting to fight the good fight and everything like that, and then they walk out of the room because we were important enough to sit us down, but you can't participate in the conversation. So it was just like, so why are we here? If you can't even sit down and have the conversation with us, or call in and not have the respect and the dignity to actually be in the room with us as an elected official, that's a problem. I don't care about scheduling. I don't care about other things going on. As someone who sits on the policy side, the campaign side, and on the ground side, and I intersect at all 3, it's very troubling to me when I see folks just kind of, again, occupying space and not taking the due diligence to make that space accessible.
Kat, I want to zero in on the Rosa Marie case, because I think it's a unique intersection of circumstances. For those of you that might not remember, Rosa Marie was a young woman, the 10-year-old young woman with cerebral palsy.
How could you not remember? It was like 3 weeks ago. Our news cycle is so quick. It's like, as you may recall, 3 weeks ago.
Exactly. And was taken away from her parents.
Right.
And
The hospital.
While in the literally
During surgery.
Literally, they ambulance chased this family to get this child.
This super threat to our immigration officials, right?
Exactly. And so within the disability community, I know we've talked a lot about the need for more conversation around the intersection of immigration issues and disability rights. Actually, any of you can weigh in too, because I know Mia, we've talked about this as well. What's gained by incorporating disability rights messaging and disability justice philosophy into broader work? And how would you guys have liked to see, like in an ideal world, going back 4 weeks ago, how would you have wanted to, what would have been an effective and inclusive way of seeing the circumstances, the response to the Rosa Marie situation play out in such a way that was inclusive of multiple communities, including the disability rights community?
Yeah, well, one thing I'll say is, if there's a silver lining to all of this Trumpism and him becoming elected president, it's all of us who have sort of popped up and stepped up in terms of advocacy. Our organization preceded Trump. I was one of the progressive Dems who thought Hillary was going to win. But once Trump did come into power, I've seen a lot more people like wanting to join the coalition, wanting to do a lot of work. So again, trying to be positive because you guys were saying this panel is supposed to be positive and not all doom and gloom. So Rebecca's laughing. So you know, the Rosa Maria case, as terrible as it was, the silver lining to that is that we saw the two communities kind of coming together. The disability community response was phenomenal in seeing and noting and reaching out to our coalition, asking for interviews, asking for, you know, for us to be on podcasts to talk about this intersection between immigration and disability. So good for the disability side, right? And of course, the immigration side has always been talking about immigration. But I'd like to, you know, as a coalition co-founder and member, I think we still have a long way to go with the Latinx side, so I'm calling that out, and other organizations as well for integrating disability. So props to disability community, because I think they're doing a good job about accepting intersectional issues and making them, you know, their issues as well. But we need to work better on the other side, calling out Latinx organizations for incorporating the disability side. And so, like I said, you know, Trump and this, you know, this vitriol, this hatred, these experiences like Rosa Maria, who's a 10-year-old with cerebral palsy, undocumented, but has been here since she's 3 months. You know, she's like the perfect like pity case, right? But so we're finally, you know, she's become the face of our movement, and you know, we're finally talking about that intersection. But you know, people with disabilities who are undocumented preceded Trump, and we just didn't talk about it, right? And it's incredible because now that we have our coalition together, you know, we filled this gap. It's 2017, and it's like we're finally talking about these intersectional issues. But our, you know, we've been here all along, and like Mia said, you know, you can't really segregate our identities, but we do, right? So, I mean, part of what the coalition wants to do is to, and what the progressive movement should do is to tap into these different communities. For example, we're tapping into the Latinx community and saying, hey, you have a disabled population in there, right? Like, and disability issues should be part of your issues, and you should feel like you're part of the disability community. And likewise, we're trying to sort of implode the disabled community as well, right? Because the disabled community has typically been, you know, white, male, no offense, you know, physically disabled, where really if you look at the majority of people with disabilities, were people like me with mental disabilities, you know, short, chubby, Latina women, you know, right, exactly. So you're pregnant. But so we're trying to redefine like what disability is, and again, even though all this is kind of like identity politics, and we're trying to highlight sort of what each cause stands for, that really we're all interconnected, and all of our different communities, our issues are interconnected.
I want to add something on to that, is that, you know, like when I was growing up, I grew up in a white family, and because I was adopted, I'm a transracial adoptee, and while I was growing up, all the disability communities would talk about my disability, and I never heard about racial issues. The things that we talked about usually were education, accessibility, and healthcare. I never heard about criminal justice reform. I would never hear about immigration, citizenship issues. I luckily had parents who did my citizenship documentation. There are tons of adoptees who have not. In fact, I think Korea just did a census that 26,000 Korean adoptees do not have their citizenship papers, which is incredible. And I think for the longest time, I had to section myself out. I was either disabled, or I was either Asian, or I was an adoptee. It was never something like that I was able to, in an organization, bring together and recognize my full self. Mm-hmm. So I think that disabled organizations, I think they still have a long way to go. I think there's been a lot of organizations popping up which have come, you know, the Harriet Tubman, you know, your organization, Disabled Latinx. I think the newer organizations that are popping up are really seeing that area that's been missing within the disability community. And I think that has been one of the amazing things that I've seen come out recently with the younger generation of protesters and advocates, is that we are starting to address that belief that we're not just one thing.
Yeah. Yeah, we need to stop talking diversity and do diversity.
And I think to take it a step further, to add to both points that have been made already, I think while yes, there's work to be done, there's a lot of accountability that disability organizations and disability advocates need to take into account as well. When we talk about, my good friend who's a member of my co-host of my podcast, but also she is started the hashtag disability too white, Valissa K. Thompson, who she started that hashtag because the disability community, for still to this day, when you think of disability advocacy, you think of it as a white-led, and in a lot of times, especially in advocacy spaces, non-disabled. You think of folks who are acting as allies, speaking for, and not necessarily, and again, to back to our previous point, taking up space. That's not to say that they shouldn't be in those spaces and they should, cede that space to someone in the disabled community. However, if they are speaking for and not allowing for the disabled community in that subsect to actually speak up for themselves, that's a problem that needs to be addressed. And while yes, this should be a positive panel, and we should be talking about the positive things going on in the community, there is, again, there is a certain level of accountability that is a problem, and does go unchecked within, there's a ton of friendly fire within our community, whether it's and this goes back to, the civil rights era and, before that to the Jim Crow era and previous to that. So, this country has a lot of work to do. This country was never great. I don't care if it never will be. But I think knowing that and living here and knowing that lived experience is so important. Knowing people's stories, knowing people's connections, and recognizing that for the folks that do sit at multiple intersections, and even the folks that sit at few intersections, there's a lot of work that needs to be done to bring those folks to the table. And again, in terms of these, organizations, there's a lot of accountability that in progressive spaces that does go unchecked, that needs to have some accountability measures in place as it relates to disability and specifically accessibility as well.
I want to ask you guys a question. We only have time for a couple more questions, but I want to talk about the tax fight that's coming up and about how we've seen how this fight is literally an assault on the disability community from the womb, looking at the rescission of the tax credit for adopting children with disabilities, to the tomb with removing the tax credit for individuals who retire on disability.
Right.
With medical expenses, student loans, et cetera, all sort of in the middle ground. Mm-hmm. What should our strategy look like going into this tax fight, and how should we be thinking about showing up in this current, with the next battle ahead?
Well, you just got me thinking, I don't know if this peripherally touches on this, that, I think a big distinction between sort of Democrats and Republicans, which is sort of embodied in this tax fight, which is, 40 years been disproved that trickle-down economics does not work, right, is that I think there's the underlying philosophy for Republicans and sort of this trickle-down method is that is this fiction of the American dream that we all can make it. One day we're all going to make it to be this rich billionaire CEO, right? But you can only do that in our society if you are the able-bodied, white, male, et cetera, et cetera. So definitely for people with disabilities, we're just, we're like not productive citizens. We're already like cast out of this sort of American dream to make it that far. Whereas I feel like, that the Democrats, mostly progressive Democrats, we sort of look at it as, like equality, right? And sort of, we need to sort of consider all like the different ways and the different embodiment that different people have, and we have to lift us all up, right? Rather than just like the trickle down or just, pull yourself up by your bootstraps and let's see if you make it, right? I'll stop there.
So I was thinking about this. Okay, so I think the problem we have is that Democrats see us as broken versions of everyone else, and they don't see us as a community. So the LGBTQ community is not, plus, and I know all the letters because being queer, but is not a bunch of straight people who happen to have, be different, have sex with people of the same gender. We're queer, we're gay, we're different. There is a common shared experience. I think progressives need to leverage that with us. So one of the things that you saw in the fight around healthcare was it wasn't just progressive strongholds where the disability community was mobilizing. We were in Oklahoma and Arizona. We were in places where Democrats don't necessarily have strongholds. And if they begin to look at addressing our interests as a community, we could potentially be pulling in a different group of folks to push back on these things. So the thing that I'm thinking about is there is a lot of talk right now about basically white suburban folks who are going to push back against Trump. And it seems like following the Virginia elections and New Jersey, there's a lot of focus on that group of people who are going to basically win the day for progressives. I think that we have failed to take into account that there are other communities who could also be leveraged if we use the right messaging. Prior to this last year, I think the disability community had been written off as not having anything to contribute to these fights. I think we busted that myth. We can mobilize, we can get people out, but the issue is the messaging has to be right. And Democrats really need to learn the messaging in the disability community and the things that are important to us and talk to the issues that are important to us to give us the tools we need to mobilize folks in these fights.
I have one last question I want to ask before we're going to turn it over to the audience, and it's a short one, but I think it's an important one. I want to end on talking about sustainability. And by sustainability, I know, and most of us come from the nonprofit space, and sustainability is about money. Sustainability is about funding. I'm going to talk about like lived sustainability. So we know that movements in general attract disabled people because by and large we are continually disenfranchised and disempowered. We also know that movements also create disabled people. Movement work is tough. It's draining. The number of folks I know that have come up to me in the last year from other progressive spaces and saying, hey, I think I'm finally going to start getting on meds for my anxiety because it's just been so hard. I've been doing immigration work for the last 10 years and it's killing me. I'm drinking too much. I need to start pulling back on my drinking because it's not a healthy habit and I'm drinking more as a result of the stress that I'm under. So you actually acquire disabilities by doing movement work. People get traumatized, people get physically injured, people get harmed in doing the work that we all do. And then when they come out with terms like, and Catherine, you and I joke about this all the time, oh, we've discovered self-care. There's this thing, it's called self-care. And we've discovered it, and we're commodifying it. It's a thing that you can do, and all of us are like, oh, that's so cute, Christopher Columbus. Yeah. We actually have it, it's in legislation, and it's called reasonable accommodation. So how can the broader progressives, or what can they be learning from us in terms of sustaining resistance? Because as Bruce said, I mean, ADAPT's been doing this for 40 plus years. The disability rights movement, we can track our earliest protests back and even beyond the Works Progress Administration and the League of the Physically Handicapped, which is still easily one of my favorite organization names ever, just because it sounds like Justice League. But how do, what can they learn from us in terms of that sort of space?
Yeah, and I think this hits big for our coalition, and we are learning because we're sort of bringing people, Latinxes with disabilities together who didn't really identify very strongly with the disability community. And one thing we have learned and that we can learn from disabled folks who've been organizing for decades is sharing resources, right? And not feeling so isolated and having that community together. And I mean, I've told you guys over and over again that it's so incredible coming out as a disabled Latina and you know, and my work for the past 2 years has really been bringing together people across the nation who are disabled Latinxes, and we felt so isolated, and we felt so alone, and we felt, you know, and we weren't sharing our resources. So what our coalition does is what disabled people have been doing all along, right? Like, you know, like we created self-care, right? We've been sharing our tactics on how to get through and how to survive, right? Is that what we're doing in our coalition as Latinx people? We're finally identifying, oh, there's other Latinx people with disabilities out there, and now we've built a community. We share resources, we share ideas, we support each other, and we come up with those creative ways. We show those creative ways of how, as disabled people and Latinx people, you know, in all our intersecting identities, how it is that we continue on. So I think a lot of the other communities can really learn from the disabled community historically and where we're at now in terms of how we come together as a community and share resources.
Anyone else want to pipe in on that?
I think, you know, it's a matter of, and I've harped this point, so I'll harp it in the last point, but I think it's a matter of ceding space and allowing for folks in the community to, instead of allies occupying space and speaking up, it's a matter of those folks in the disability community to that have their own voices to speak up and speak on certain issues. Mm-hmm. And to take it a step further, I think there's certain conversations and certain articles. I mean, whether it's a article in a medical journal or it's just a listicle on BuzzFeed, there's spaces to, like, you know, I can remember the early days of BuzzFeed where there were spoon theory listicles mocking the spoon theory, and you know, we're talking about you know, self-care and things like that, which means, you know, and the spoon, you know, spoon theory is an addition to that, and started before self-care started, and before self-care was a hot topic or a thing. So I think it's a matter of, again, connecting stories and making sure that the voices who are sitting at the intersections that have those voices have the opportunity to speak, and not allowing for folks who maybe have more privileges afforded to them to amplify those folks rather than speaking for.
Okay, well, I'm going to turn it over to the audience for questions. I think we have time for 1 or 2 questions of our panelists.
Yes.
This was outstanding.
Yes.
I'm Laureen Stammers. I work at the American Association for the Advancement of Science, which used to be this building. Now it's 3 blocks away. I do an internship program in STEM for disabled college students. I've been thinking about unconscious bias, and I wanted to know if that's being addressed, because I think that with all the great work people are doing in advocacy and other things, that people are still reenacting their experiences, what they heard as young people, what they did as young people, the assumptions they grew up with, and I'm trying to figure out, how do you encourage people to process those early experiences so they can be better allies and better advocates and not rely on their assumptions and things they learned about and don't quite want to let go of.
That's a
Can I-
great question. Go ahead.
Yeah. So thank you for that question. I remember this time a couple of months ago. I went to the Netroots conference and went with I had a friend there. His name is Tony, and he is a DACA a recipient. And we were. It was right after Charlottesville. Everybody, of course, at Netroots, because we're a big progressive conference, was extremely upset and weren't sure how to display the emotions that we had. So people decided to organize a march. And so we marched in Atlanta the day after Charlottesville. And I remember we were, they put all the disabled people in the front. So we walked in the front, and when we got up to the Capitol building, there were stairs, and people didn't understand that those stairs, what they represented to the disabled community, and how it sort of symbolizes all the oppression that we face, because a lot of people don't notice stairs until they walk with us. And so what happened was that a lot of people wanted to go up the stairs. They wanted to just force us to go around alone. And what happened was that I and my friend Tony, we spoke up to the organizers of the march, and we were like, hey, you know, if we really want to be intersectional, if we really want to push for the values that we're preaching at this conference, that we have to have everybody go through the accessible way. And what happened was that my friend Tony, he got extremely upset. I just saw he just started crying, and he was extremely emotional. And this guy was trying to tell him, you know, calm down, like this isn't a big deal. And it was to my friend, because he saw this connection between my oppression and his oppression. He understood that there were tons of people telling us and him what was right and what was wrong, and what was acceptable behavior and what was not acceptable behavior. And during that time, I just it clicked. I mean, it's clicked in my mind before, but emotionally, spiritually, this clicked to me to see that all oppression is connected. And to understand, if we can all understand that, then we can address this unconscious bias. We can say, well, you had this experience. Let me tell you about my experience. And let's see how that connects. And let's see how those oppressions interact with each other. And let's see how we can build off of that.
Yeah. I kind of want to go back to the hashtag disabled reporter. And I think it was kind of unique with this election, right? That like, I mean, you know, we look at the stats and we're looking back on this how this election went, and all the press and the debates and everything. And there wasn't really a focus on policy. There wasn't really a focus on anything substance. It was more just like, you know, I'm thinking of a bunch of cuss words in my head, but it was just like, you know, a mudslinging show. You know, so with the surge, actually, I mean, I think, you know, again, it wasn't just disability, it was a lot of different things, but when disability finally came up in this election cycle as a debate, like we lean on sort of like our unconscious bias, which is what you're talking about, right? And it's just like the idea of you know, the pity, like how dare this person mock someone with a disability, and that's as deep as we got. And so I think with this election, I mean, beyond disability even, sort of taught us is like we need to go back to talking about the issues. We need to go back to like getting beyond the surface of just disability is bad and sad and we pity them, right? And I mean, like, think about it. I mean, what were the candidates' positions on disability? Well, once I didn't have a position, but I mean, I know Hillary had something on her page about disability rights, but nobody could articulate that, right? Because we were just talking about the disabled reporter, #disabled reporter, right? And the pity and the bad and the sad. So I think to move beyond this like unconscious bias and this surface level and this like gut reaction of disability is only bad and sad, we need to talk about our policy issues. We need to listen to ADAPT. We need to listen to the people on the ground. We need to listen to stories. We need to connect more. And we need to just like fly our freak flags and just, be out there and let it be acceptable for us to be out there and tell our stories and what we want from our perspective, right? And not the parents or the organizations that don't really, speak for us or try to speak for us. And shift the dialogue to that instead of just the bad and sad and the pity and the, fund my cure research. Did that make sense?
Definitely. I think we have time for one more question. Is there another question?
Hi, Michelle Bishop with National Disability Rights Network. I'd first, just before my question, wanted to say thank you so much to CAP for finally really stepping up and taking responsibility for disability issues as part of the progressive movement. And congrats to you, Rebecca, for your role in that. Right?
Both
My
Rebeccas.
question is an easy one. I really just want to know, Neil, what's your podcast? Because I want to start listening to it immediately.
Well, my podcast is called Wheelin' and Dealin'. We are, and it's not it's not just my podcast. Obviously, it's Felicia's as well, and we do a fantastic job. Feel free to listen. We're on episode 4, I believe. We're going to have a few more episodes. Rebecca's actually going to be a future guest, and a lot of other folks in this room as well. So, look forward to that. It's called Wheelin' and Dealin'. It's very easy to find on iTunes or any other podcasting, wherever you listen to podcasts.
I love podcasts.
Podcasts are awesome.
Yep.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. I want to thank all of our speakers. I want to thank our logistics team here, our CART folks, our sign language interpreters, everybody that it takes to pull something like this together. And we look forward to this being the first of an ongoing series of conversations on disability at CAP. And yet again, that is the hashtag, disability at CAP. Thank you so much.